It is July 25, 1865. London. A house on Margaret Street, in the Marylebone district, a respectable area of the city, just north of Oxford Street. Inside, a retired army officer lies dead. The cause is dysentery, an intestinal disease, common, unglamorous, the kind of death that ends a life rather than defining it. The man who has just died is Dr. James Barry, Inspector General of Hospitals, the second highest medical rank in the British Army. A career spanning 46 years and every corner of the British Empire, from the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, to the island of St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic, to Malta, to Jamaica, to the Crimea, to Canada. His explicit final instruction: bury him in the clothes he died in. No examination of the body. Immediate interment. Those instructions are not followed. A charwoman is brought in to lay out the body for burial, and what she finds causes her to sit with the information for several days while she decides what to do with it. Then she tries to sell it. She approaches Barry's doctor, Major D.R. McKinnon, who has signed the death certificate. She tells him what she found. She wants money for her silence. McKinnon refuses. And so, the charwoman goes to the newspapers. The story that emerges, spreading within days from Dublin to London to every corner of the British Empire, is this: Dr. James Barry, Inspector General of Hospitals, one of the most senior military surgeons in British history, the man who performed the first successful Caesarean section in the British Empire, the man who had publicly dressed down Florence Nightingale in the Crimea, the man who had fought pistol duels and won, was born a woman. The British Army's response is immediate and total. Barry's service records are sealed. All documentation is locked away. The embargo lasts for 100 years. When a historian finally gains access in the 1950s, what she finds is not a curiosity. It is a life of extraordinary medical accomplishment. A life that was nearly erased. 3 questions will follow us today. How did a young woman from Cork, Ireland, enter the University of Edinburgh as a man, qualify as a doctor, pass through the Army Medical Board, and sustain a deception across 5 decades and dozens of postings without a single official exposure? What did Barry actually accomplish? And why did the British military spend a century trying to ensure those accomplishments were forgotten? And what do we make of the life behind the disguise? The secret pregnancy, the relationships, the private cost of a deception that never ended. Before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling is what you have been looking for, the subscribe button is just below this video. We cover true crime and hidden history from around the world, told with the detail and care it deserves. No sensationalism. No rushing through the facts. Just the full story, properly told. Hit subscribe, and you won't miss the next one. To understand what Barry built, and what was nearly taken from him, we have to go back. Back to Cork. Back to a family in crisis. And back to the moment a plan was made that would define the next 56 years. Cork, Ireland, 1789. Cork is a city on the southern coast of Ireland, a busy port, a commercial hub, a place where the rhythms of British imperial trade are constantly audible. In 1789, the year Margaret Anne Bulkley is born, Cork is a city of ships and warehouses, of merchants and soldiers, of families living under the weight of a colonial system that controls almost everything about their lives. Margaret's father, Jeremiah Bulkley, runs a grocer's shop on Merchant's Quay, a modest business, not destitute, but not secure either. Margaret's mother, Mary Anne, is the sister of a man who will become important to this story, James Barry, a painter of some reputation, a professor at London's Royal Academy of Arts, a man with connections in the world of British letters and learning. Margaret grows up in this household through the late 1790s and into the first decade of the 1800s. Ireland in this era offers her almost nothing. A woman of her class might marry, might teach, might spend her life in the narrow corridor between respectable poverty and respectable dependence. She will do none of these things. The plan: what was hatched and why? Sometime in the first decade of the 1800s, the Bulkley family reaches a crisis. Jeremiah Bulkley is imprisoned for debt. The family's modest stability collapses. Mary Anne writes to her brother, the painter James Barrie in London. He is a man of radical politics and unconventional views. He has connections to Francisco de Miranda, a Venezuelan revolutionary general with ambitions to liberate South America from Spanish colonial rule, living in London at the time. The plan that emerges is audacious in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate at this distance. Margaret Anne Bulkley will go to Edinburgh. She will enroll at the University of Edinburgh Medical School, at the time, the finest medical school in Britain, possibly in the world. She will enroll as a man. She will use the name of her uncle, the painter, James Barrie. She will qualify as a doctor. And then she will use that qualification to make a life that the world would not permit Margaret Bulkley to make. The original plan, apparently, was that she would travel to Venezuela with Miranda and serve as a physician in his revolutionary army. That plan collapsed when Miranda's South American venture failed in 1806. But the plan to become James Barrie did not collapse. It found a different destination. Who Margaret was, before she became James. Before we continue, I want to spend a moment with Margaret Anne Bulkley, because she is about to disappear into history under a different name, and the person she was before that deserves acknowledgement. She is, by the time the plan is made, in her late teens or early 20s. She has been educated enough to read, to write, to engage with ideas, more educated than most women of her background and era. She has, somewhere in her life, experienced something that will leave a physical mark that persists into the next century. There are stretch marks on her body, marks consistent with pregnancy and childbirth. The evidence, pieced together carefully by later researchers, suggests that Margaret Bulkley bore a child before she became James Barrie. The child, probably a daughter, named Juliana Bulkley, was apparently raised as Margaret's sister in the family home. Juliana would never know that her mother had gone on to become one of the most senior surgeons in the British Army. The circumstances of the pregnancy are not documented. The most carefully considered theory, given the era and the family's circumstances, is that Margaret was sexually assaulted, and the child was the result. Whether this experience contributed to the decision to become James Barrie, to step permanently out of the female world that had offered her so little protection, we cannot know with certainty. But I find it impossible to look at the life that follows without thinking about what she left behind. Edinburgh, the transformation. In the autumn of 1809, a slim, smooth-skinned young person arrives at the University of Edinburgh and presents themselves for enrollment in the medical school. They give their name as James Barrie. They carry a letter of introduction from Lord Buchan, a Scottish peer with progressive views, connected to the family through the painter Barrie. The University Senate was immediately suspicious. Not of the sex or the age. James Barrie appears to be extraordinarily young, possibly as young as 12 or 13. The Senate attempts to block the application for the final examinations on the grounds that the candidate appears too young to have completed the course. Lord Buchan intervenes personally. Then Senate relents. Barrie qualifies as a medical doctor in 1812, at the age of approximately 23. The thesis is on femoral hernia. The degree is granted. The physical challenge of appearing male when you are a young woman in her 20s involves, in Barrie's case, a set of practical solutions that are elegant in their simplicity. Barrie is small, under 5 feet in height. The smooth skin and the absence of a beard, explained away as extreme youth, are genuine biological features, not fabrications. The high voice, also attributed to adolescence, is simply Barrie's voice. What needs to be added are the smaller things. The posture. The costume. Barrie wears an overcoat to broaden the shoulders, small towels stuffed inside to suggest a different body shape. 3-inch soles added to boots to gain height. And a sword, because an officer and a gentleman carries a sword, and carrying a sword communicates something about who you are that goes well beyond the physical. Most importantly, Barrie cultivates a reputation for a short temper and aggressive self-defense of personal dignity. Early in the career, when someone makes comments about the high voice or the smooth chin, they are met with a challenge. Barrie later shoots one such tormentor, Captain Josias Cloete of the 21st Light Dragoons, in a pistol duel. The bullet strikes the captain's hat and removes its peak. The teasing about Barrie's appearance dies down significantly after this. Into the army, the career begins. Barry moves to London after Edinburgh, training as a surgical pupil at the United Hospitals of Guy's and St. Thomas's, among the most prestigious teaching hospitals in England. The teachers include Astley Cooper, one of the most celebrated surgeons of the era. In July 1813, Barry passes the examination of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. He presents himself to the Army Medical Department. He is accepted. He begins his military career as a hospital assistant at the Military Hospital in Chelsea, then at the Royal Military Hospital in Plymouth, helping treat wounded soldiers and French prisoners from the Napoleonic Wars. He is, at this moment, the first woman in British history to hold a medical degree from the University of Edinburgh. The first woman to be a member of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. Neither of these facts is known to anyone outside a tiny circle of family members who were part of the original plan. And the secret is now self-sustaining. Because the alternative, exposure, is not merely embarrassing. It is career-ending, reputation-destroying, possibly criminal. The Army Medical Department does not employ women. The Royal College of Surgeons does not admit women. The entire structure of Barry's life rests on a foundation that cannot be examined. So he keeps moving. He keeps working. He gets better and better at medicine. And in 1816, he gets posted to Cape Town. Cape Town, South Africa, 1816. Cape Town is, in 1816, a relatively recent British acquisition. The Dutch had established the Cape Colony in the 17th century as a victualling station for ships rounding the southern tip of Africa. The British took it during the Napoleonic Wars. In 1816 it is a colonial outpost, administratively complex, climatically unusual, socially a mixture of British officers, Dutch settlers, indigenous African populations, and enslaved people. Barry arrives here as a hospital assistant, a junior rank. He will stay for a decade. And in those 10 years, almost everything that defines his career and his legacy will happen. Lord Charles Somerset and the question of proximity. The governor of the Cape Colony when Barry arrives is Lord Charles Henry Somerset, an aristocrat, a military man, a recent widower with 2 daughters. Barry treats his sick elder daughter, Georgiana. The daughter recovers completely. Somerset is grateful, then devoted, then dependent on Barry in ways that go well beyond gratitude. Within a few years, Barry has been appointed Somerset's personal physician, made colonial medical inspector, a significant jump from his military rank, and moved into accommodation within the governor's establishment. The gossip begins. In June 1824, a note is found posted on a bridge in Cape Town. The note accuses Somerset and Barry of a sexual relationship, using language explicit by Victorian standards, suggesting a homosexual relationship between the governor and his young physician. This accusation is a criminal matter under the laws of the time. There is a court investigation. Somerset denies everything. Barry denies everything. The investigation goes nowhere. The question of what actually existed between them is one historians have been circling ever since. What was documented is this: Somerset knew, or came to know, about Barry's biological sex. Several sources suggest he was aware. And he said nothing. He protected Barry's position, promoted his career, and ensured that the accusation of homosexuality, catastrophically damaging to both under the laws of the era, did not take hold. Whether their relationship was romantic, intimate in some other sense, or simply that of 2 people who knew each other's most dangerous secret and chose to protect each other, the record does not settle this. And given that both kept the secret, we cannot know. The Caesarean section, July 1826. It is July 1826. In a suburb of Cape Town, a woman named Wilhelmina Munnik is in the final stages of a labor that is not progressing. Her husband, Thomas, is a Cape Town merchant. Wilhelmina's condition is deteriorating. Barry is called. He assesses the situation. He decides will perform a Caesarean section. At this moment in history, Caesarean sections are almost universally fatal for the mother. The operation is occasionally performed when the mother is already dying, to attempt to save the child. The idea of performing one with the intention of saving both mother and child, Planning it, executing it as a premeditated surgical procedure rather than a last resort, is almost without precedent in British medicine. Barry has read of 3 cases in which both mother and child survived a Caesarean. None were performed in the British Empire. He has also, according to researchers, who later pieced together his life, a knowledge that no other practicing surgeon of his era possesses from personal experience. He knows what childbirth feels like from the inside. The biographers Michael Dupreez and Jeremy Dronfield put it plainly: Barry had a secret advantage. There was not another practicing physician or surgeon in the world who knew from personal experience what it was like to bear a child. The surgery is performed. Wilhelmina Munnik survives. The child survives. The baby boy is named James Barry Munnik, in honor of his deliverer. Barry stays beside Wilhelmina for the rest of the day. That name, James Barry Munnik, will pass through the family for generations. A later Prime Minister of South Africa, James Barry Munnik Hertzog, who held office in the 1920s and 1930s, carries the legacy of that July afternoon in Cape Town in his own name, without ever knowing its full significance. The Empire, 3 decades of reform. After Cape Town, Barry is posted across the empire. Mauritius, a small island off the eastern coast of Madagascar. Jamaica in the Caribbean. St. Helena, the remote South Atlantic island where Napoleon Bonaparte died in exile. Corfu. Trinidad. Jamaica again. Everywhere Barry goes, 2 things happen. The first is reform. Barry fights, at significant personal and professional cost, for better sanitation in military hospitals. For proper nutrition for patients. For clean water. For the humane treatment of prisoners, people with leprosy, the mentally ill, enslaved people. He is demoted twice for insubordination, for pushing too hard against officials who do not want to spend money on the people in their care. He is arrested once. He does not stop. The second thing that happens everywhere Barry goes is that the secret holds. Not because nobody ever suspects. People suspect regularly. The voice. The height. The absence of facial hair well into what should be middle age. The slightly unusual figure beneath the immaculate uniform. The insistence on bathing alone, always, with a ferocity that colleagues attribute to eccentricity. But suspicion and certainty are different things. And in the rigid hierarchical world of the 19th century British Army, the gap between "I suspect something unusual about this officer" and "I will raise this formally" is wide enough that a career can be built in it. Barry's reputation, for surgical skill, for results, for an absolutely terrifying willingness to challenge anyone who makes a comment about his appearance, does the rest. The Crimea, Florence Nightingale. In 1854, Britain is at war with Russia. The Crimean War, fought on the Crimean Peninsula in what is now Ukraine, is one of the most catastrophically mismanaged military conflicts in British history. The hospitals are scandalous. The conditions are lethal. Men die of cholera, dysentery, and infection at rates that dwarf the battle casualties. Florence Nightingale arrives at the Barak Hospital in Scutari, near Constantinople, in what is now Turkey, in November 1854. She is 34 years old. She begins the process of reforming hospital conditions that will make her one of the most celebrated figures in Victorian England. Barry visits the Crimea during the war. He goes without official sanction. He is technically on leave. And when he encounters Nightingale, something goes publicly and memorably wrong between them. Barry reportedly berates Nightingale publicly, stops her on the hospital square, in front of soldiers and staff, and delivers what she later calls a blackguard rating. Her account, written after Barry's death, is vivid. "I never had such a blackguard rating in all my life, I who have had more than any woman, than from this Barry sitting on his horse, while I was crossing the hospital square with only my cap on in the sun. He kept me standing in the midst of quite a crowd of soldiers, commissariat, servants, camp followers, etc., every one of whom behaved like a gentleman during the scolding I received while he behaved like a brute." After Barry's death, when Nightingale learns the secret, she adds, "I should say that Barry was the most hardened creature I ever met throughout the army." What was Barry's objection to Nightingale? The accounts are not entirely clear. But here is the most plausible explanation. The reforms Nightingale was implementing at Scutari, hospital hygiene, sanitation, proper diet, clean water, were reforms that Barry had been fighting to implement in military hospitals for 30 years. In Cape Town, in Mauritius, in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, and in Corfu. Barry's achievements in those places were unknown to the wider public. Nightingale's were about to become the defining story of Victorian nursing reform. The Lady with the Lamp would be celebrated by Queen Victoria, written about in newspapers, elevated almost to sainthood. Barry would be forgotten. Whether that felt like an injustice, whether Barry, watching Nightingale's ascent, was confronting something about the permanent invisibility of his own accomplishments, we cannot know. But I find it hard to think about that moment on the hospital square at Scutari without sitting with that possibility. Canada and the forced retirement. In 1857, Barry is appointed Inspector General of Hospitals for Upper and Lower Canada, the territory that is now Ontario, Quebec, and Newfoundland. It is the highest posting he will hold. The second most senior medical office in the British Army. He is, at this point, in his late 60s. The years of tropical postings, the Caribbean heat, the African sun, have left him poorly suited to cold. Canada in the 1850s is not a kind environment for a man of his age and constitution. In 1857 he falls seriously ill. He is brought back to London to recover. In 1859, the Army Medical Board formally declares Barry unfit for service due to ill health and old age. He argues against the decision. He writes, "I am now prepared to serve Her Majesty in any quarter of the globe to which I may be sent," but does not succeed. He is retired against his will. He spends his final years in London at the house on Margaret Street. His faithful servant, known in documents only as John, a black man who has been with Barry since the South Africa years, is with him. His dog, a poodle named Psyche, who appears beside him in one of the few surviving photographs, is with him too. Barry dies on July 25, 1865, of dysentery. The same disease he had seen kill so many of the soldiers he spent his career trying to protect. The charwoman's discovery and the failed blackmail. Barry's last instruction: bury him in the clothes he died in. No examination. The instruction is ignored. A charwoman is brought in to prepare the body for burial. She discovers that the body she is laying out is not anatomically male. She also observes, or claims to observe, marks on the body consistent with pregnancy and childbirth. She holds this information for some days. Then she approaches Major McKinnon, Barry's physician, the man who signed the death certificate, and explains what she found, and asks for money. McKinnon refuses. The charwoman goes to the newspapers. Here is the first reversal in this story. The revelation was not made out of principle, or compassion, or historical duty. It was made because a blackmail attempt failed. The truth about Barry's life, protected for 56 years with extraordinary discipline, became public because someone who found it out tried to profit from it, and the person they approached would not pay. The story breaks in a Dublin newspaper on August 14, 1865, less than 3 weeks after Barry's death. Upon his death was discovered to be a woman. Within a week it has spread throughout Britain and the Empire. The Army's response: 100 years of silence. The British Army does not issue a statement. It does not acknowledge the story. It does not investigate or respond publicly. It seals the records. All documentation relating to Dr. James Barry, the service record, official correspondence, medical reports, is placed under embargo. It will not be accessible to researchers for 100 years. This is the second reversal. The institution Barry served for 46 years did not honor him. It buried him a second time. Not in the ground, but in the archive. The stated justification, to the extent there is one, is embarrassment. The Army Medical Department, and through it, the Royal College of Surgeons, the University of Edinburgh, every institution whose examinations Barry passed, had been, in some sense, deceived. A woman had passed their examinations, held their credentials, outperformed the men around her, and risen to the second highest medical rank in the British Army. The Army's response to discovering this was not pride. It was not acknowledgement. It was a filing cabinet and a lock that would not be opened for a century. What the public said. After the charwoman's story breaks, there is intense public discussion. And the reactions are, in their way, more revealing than anything Barry did or said. Some of those who had known Barry claimed they had always suspected. Several former colleagues said they had known, had kept the secret out of respect for Barry's wishes and evident competence. Whether this is true or retrospective self-flattery is impossible to determine. Others flatly refused to believe it. They insisted Barry must have been a hermaphrodite, a person biologically neither fully male nor female, or a male who had never fully developed. The idea that a woman had done everything Barry did, had gone everywhere Barry went, had operated and reformed and argued and dueled, was beyond what some were prepared to accept. And Florence Nightingale, on hearing the news, reportedly gloated. She had been publicly humiliated by Barry in the Crimea. She now had something she could use. She ensures, through her considerable influence over military and medical circles, that Barry is excluded from the Royal Commission on Army Doctors that she helps to shape in the years after the war. The woman who had been publicly dressed down by Barry helps ensure that Barry's legacy is erased. How the secret held, the structural answer. At this point in the story, I want to address the question I asked at the beginning. How do you sustain this deception, across 56 years, across every corner of the British Empire, through examinations, promotions, medical emergencies, duels, arrests, demotions, and the death of every person who knew the original plan? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because the answer says something important about the world around Barry, not just about Barry himself. The answer has several components, and none of them are individually sufficient. The first is that the deception was not especially elaborate. Barry did not maintain a complex false biography. He simply did the job, did it well, and kept moving. In the 19th century British Army, you are posted every few years to new locations, meeting new colleagues. Nobody accumulates a long enough observation of you to be certain. The second is that the attributes which made Barry look suspicious, the voice, the height, the smooth skin, were all explained by the same cover story, extreme youth. And as Barry aged and that story became less plausible, the professional reputation was already established. You do not challenge a surgeon who has operated successfully for 20 years and been demoted twice for arguing on behalf of patients. The third component is the most structural. The people around Barry were, in many cases, seeing what they expected to see. The British Army of the 19th century did not expect to encounter a woman in the medical hierarchy. The possibility was institutionally inconceivable. When something is inconceivable, the mind finds alternative explanations for the evidence: youth, eccentricity, illness, rather than the inconceivable conclusion. This is not stupidity. It is how human perception works under the pressure of strong prior expectations. And the fourth component is simply this: Barry was genuinely, impressively good at medicine. When the work is that good, the incentive to look closely at the person doing it is reduced. The results speak for themselves. The third reversal, the records finally opened. In the 1950s, 90 years after Barry's death and 5 years before the Army's embargo would officially lift, a historian named Isabel Ray obtains access to the Barry papers. What she finds is not the curiosity the Army wanted to bury. It is a life. The reforms in Cape Town. The Caesarean section. The improvements to leper colonies, prisons, mental asylums, military hospitals across the empire. The advocacy for enslaved people. The fights with officials who wanted to maintain the status quo of suffering and neglect. Ray's work, published as The Strange Story of Dr. James Barry, begins the recovery. Later researchers, particularly Michael Dupreez, a retired South African doctor who spent decades tracing Barry's family history, go further. They establish the birth identity. They find the letter that confirms the family connection. They piece together the pregnancy, the child, the family structure that made the original plan possible. The Army sealed the records because it was embarrassed. What the records contain is not embarrassing. It is remarkable. The third reversal, the records finally opened. In the 1950s, 90 years after Barry's death and 5 years before the army's embargo would officially lift, a historian named Isabel Ray obtains access to the Barry papers. What she finds is not the curiosity the army wanted to bury. It is a life. The reforms in Cape Town. The Caesarean section. The improvements to leper colonies, prisons, mental asylums, military hospitals across the empire. The advocacy for enslaved people. The fights with officials who wanted to maintain the status quo of suffering and neglect. Ray's work, published as The Strange Story of Dr. James Barry, begins the recovery. Later researchers, particularly Michael Du Preez, a retired South African doctor who spent decades tracing Barry's family history, go further. They establish the birth identity. They find the letter that confirms the family connection. They piece together the pregnancy, the child, the family structure that made the original plan possible. The army sealed the records because it was embarrassed. What the records contain is not embarrassing. It is remarkable. What did this cost? The physical cost. Barry could never be examined by a doctor without risk of exposure. He treated his own illnesses as much as possible, managing the situation with the care of someone who knows a single unguarded moment could end everything. He bathed alone. He dressed alone. He insisted on privacy with a ferocity that colleagues attributed to eccentricity. The relational cost. Close relationships carry exposure risk. Barry was known as professionally warm, good with patients, genuinely concerned with the welfare of the people in his care. But personally, most relationships were kept at a distance. The exceptions, Somerset, the servant John, were people who either knew or came very close to knowing. The relationship with Somerset, in particular, suggests that mutual knowledge of an explosive secret created something genuine and durable between them. The legacy cost. Barry spent 46 years building a medical record that was, by any measure, extraordinary. And then the institution he served decided that the best response to learning who he was to pretend he had never existed. What Barry was, as a doctor. Here is what I keep coming back to. Barry was not simply a person who disguised themselves to gain access to a career. Barry was an exceptional doctor. Not adequate. Not competent for the era. Exceptional. The Caesarean section of 1826 is still cited in surgical histories. The reforms Barry implemented in Cape Town, clean water, proper ventilation, regulated medicines, humane treatment of the mentally ill, were implemented decades before they became standard practice in Britain. Barry fought against the accepted maltreatment of prisoners, lepers, and enslaved people not because it was professionally advantageous, it was not, but because it was wrong, and he had apparently decided that making enemies in defense of the right thing was worth the career cost. He was demoted for it. He was arrested for it. He was posted to Canada in old age, partly as punishment for this attitude. He was right about almost everything he argued for. Florence Nightingale implemented many of the same reforms a generation later at Scutari, and became one of the most celebrated women in British history. Barry implemented them decades earlier, across the empire, and was erased. That gap is not incidental. That gap is the story. The question nobody can answer. We do not have Barry's voice on the question of his inner identity. But we have one thing close to it. In a play written long after Barry's death, Sebastian Barry's Whistling Psyche, imagining an afterlife meeting between the two, the playwright gives Barry a speech in which he describes himself as that other sort of creature, neither white nor black, nor brown nor even green, but the strange original that is an Irish person. That line is fictional. James Barry did not say it. But what it points at, existing in a category the world has no name for, falling between every defined boundary, maintaining a life that does not fit the available frameworks, that is something the historical record, read carefully, does gesture toward. Barry lived between categories for 56 years. British and Irish. Army officer and secret civilian. Male by title and female by birth. Celebrated in his work and invisible in his identity. At war with the institutions he served, and in service to them his entire career. What that felt like from the inside is something we will never fully know. What the embargo did. The British Army's decision to seal Barry's records for 100 years had consequences that went far beyond institutional embarrassment management. The consequence was that Barry's medical contributions were unknown for a century. The person who performed the first successful Caesarean section in the British Empire was not included in surgical histories written and taught in the decades after 1865. The person who had argued, at great professional cost, for humane treatment of the vulnerable in every institution he visited, was not cited in histories of hospital reform. Florence Nightingale was cited. She was celebrated. She was right to be celebrated. Her work was real and important. But so was Barry's. And Barry was not there. The embargo was lifted in 1965, precisely 100 years after Barry's death. By then, the generation who had known him was long gone. The records were available, but they were not famous. They were waiting for someone to look. The recovery of the legacy. Isabel Ray looked in the 1950s. Her book opened the archive. Later researchers continued the excavation. Michael Dupreez, working across archives in Ireland, Britain, and South Africa over decades, established the family connection, the birth identity, the pregnancy, and the daughter Juliana, who never knew her mother, had become one of the most senior doctors in the British Army. The child, named James Barry Munnick, delivered in Cape Town in 1826, passed the name down through the Munnick family for generations. A Prime Minister of South Africa, James Barry Munnick Hertzog, carried the legacy of that surgery in his name without ever knowing its full story. The Royal College of Surgeons of England officially admitted women for the first time in 1911. That is 98 years after Barry had already been a member, without the college knowing it. The University of Edinburgh Medical School, the institution that almost refused to allow Barry to sit his examinations, has since officially recognized Barry as one of its alumni. What remains? On July 25, 1865, a person who had spent 56 years as Dr. James Barry died in a house on Margaret Street in London. That person was born Margaret Anne Bulkley in Cork, Ireland, around 1789. She survived a childhood marked by financial collapse and, almost certainly, a traumatic pregnancy. She entered the University of Edinburgh under a false name and a male identity. She qualified as a doctor. She passed the examinations of the Royal College of Surgeons. She joined the British Army and served it for 46 years, across 5 continents and every tropical disease the 19th century empire had to offer. She performed the first successful Caesarean section in British medical history. She reformed hospital conditions across the empire. She fought for the humane treatment of every person in the institutions she visited, regardless of class, race, or legal status. She was demoted, arrested, exiled to Canada in old age, and retired against her will. She told her doctor, "Bury me in the clothes I died in." No examination. Someone didn't listen. And after the charwoman told the newspapers, and the army sealed the files, and Florence Nightingale gloated, and the Victorian public argued about what it all meant, a life was almost lost. Not the physical life. The record. The work. The meaning of it. The record was recovered. But it took 100 years of silence first. Whether Barry was a woman living as a man to practice medicine, or a man who had been born into the wrong body, or something that sits outside our available categories, the record does not tell us. Barry told us nothing about that, because Barry spent 56 years ensuring that nobody asked. What the record does tell us is this. In a world that offered Margaret Anne Bulkley almost nothing, no education beyond what could be improvised, no career beyond marriage or domestic service, no protection from violence or poverty or the reduction of a human life to a function, someone decided. And then kept it for 56 years. And then the British Army kept it for 100 more. The gravestone at Kensal Green Cemetery in London reads, Dr. James Barry, Inspector General of Hospitals. Died July 26, 1865. It does not say what he was, what he achieved, what he fought for. It just says the name he chose. And in the end, after the charwoman and the newspapers and the embargo and the historians and the recovery, the name is still there. It turned out to be enough. There are lives that change the world while the world is looking the other way. James Barrie was one of them. He was born into a world that had already decided what he was and what he would become. He walked through every wall it built. Without permission. Without acknowledgement. With a name that was not his own and a determination that never once announced itself, because it could not afford to. He qualified as a doctor when women were not permitted to sit the examinations. He joined an army that did not employ women. He rose to its second highest medical rank. And along the way he changed the water supply, the hospital conditions, the treatment of prisoners and lepers and enslaved people and the mentally ill in every institution he passed through. He was demoted for it, arrested for it, exiled in old age as punishment for it. He did not stop. He performed the first successful Caesarean section in British medical history. The child born that day was named after him. That name was eventually borne by a prime minister. He fought Florence Nightingale to a standstill in the Crimea, and she spent the rest of her life helping ensure he was forgotten. He deserved better. He deserved to be in the history books. He deserved to have his daughter know who her mother was. He deserved to die under his own instructions, buried in the clothes he chose, without a charwoman's discovery and a blackmail attempt and a scandal that spread across the empire in days. The British Army's response to learning who he was to seal his files for 100 years. The files are open now. The record is there. He chose a name. He held it for 56 years. He asked to be buried in it. That name is on a gravestone at Kensal Green Cemetery in London. Dr. James Barrie, Inspector General of Hospitals. It was enough to change the world. It should have been enough to be remembered. It is not. Rest well, Dr. Barrie. Subscribe to Enter the Crime for true crime and hidden history told with the rigor it deserves. And tell us in the comments, how do you think Barrie sustained this deception across 56 years and every corner of the British Empire? And what should the legacy of this life look like? A life that was almost deliberately erased.